All right, everyone, we'd like to go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you to this Policy and Practice seminar, which is hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy. My name is Philip Ayub. I'm a professor in the department, and I'm also your chair the chair of this event this evening. The title of the seminar tonight is Challenges Faced by LGBTIQ+ Migrants and Asylum Seekers. LGBTIQ+ people continue to face persecution and discrimination in virtually every region of the world. Some of them are forced to migrate or seek asylum, which can be an arduous process, with still too few states granting asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, and the ones that do often failing to understand other ways of being queer, so other ways compared to their own societies, and sometimes deploying intrusive processes of proving one's credibility, as well as the other challenges that legal frameworks and everyday life pose for migrants and asylum seekers in receiving countries. Our panelists today will discuss the unique challenges that LGBTIQ+ migrants and asylum seekers face in their home countries, in the course of migration, and in their receiving countries. We'll also find time to talk about the contributions of these actors are making in their own societies, both their past societies and their present ones. So to discuss this topic, we're really delighted to welcome two just fantastic speakers tonight, who I will introduce in the order in which they'll be making their opening remarks. First, on the end, we have Dr. Sarah Singer, who is a senior lecturer in refugee law at the Refugee Law Initiative, which is in the School for Advanced Study at the University of London. Her research interests are refugee law and policy, human rights, and migration. She is a recognized expert on criminality and asylum and has a broader research expertise on humanitarian accountability, detention, and protection of LGBTI+ asylum seekers. Next to me, we have Dr. Aydan Greatrick, who is a visiting researcher at the Department of Geography in the University of Leeds, and an expert on LGBTQ+ asylum support, protection, and forced migration. He has over 7 years of experience researching the intersections between forced migration, humanitarianism, gender, and sexuality, with a particular focus on LGBTQ+ asylum and displacement in Europe and the Middle East. And I should note also here at UCL with Dr. Richard Mole, who we have in the audience today, and who has done a lot of great work also on queer asylum and migration. So the format for tonight, we'll have each speaker offer their opening remarks for about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a panel discussion between the three of us for about 20 minutes, and then we'll open to the floor for the remaining time we have, and we'll make sure that that's at least 30 minutes. And a final note before I hand over to our first speaker is that the whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website, on our YouTube channel, and on our podcast after this event. So if you do speak, just please keep in mind that you will be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you will not. Of course, we would love for you to speak, but you should know that it is a public format here. We'll also we'll let you know when the recording is available, and we hope that you might want to share it with others. So now it is my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Sarah Singer.
Oh, thank you very much for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this seminar today. Just to start with an apology, my voice is going slightly, so I hope that you can all hear me clearly and then it lasts for the session. But please do just let me know if you need me to speak up at all. So today I'm going to be speaking about some of the challenges facing LGBT+ asylum seekers as they navigate the legal landscape in countries in which they seek asylum, and particularly focusing on the UK. And this all has to be set against the backdrop of, I think, what we can only describe as a really hostile environment for asylum seekers and refugees in Europe, but particularly in the UK at the moment. Many of you will have heard of the Rwanda asylum deal, which has recently been negotiated, with plans to send asylum seekers to Rwanda to have their claims assessed and to receive protection there. We're seeing increasingly harsh rhetoric from senior political figures describing invasions and swarms of refugees and asylum seekers. We've seen Prime Minister Rishi Sunak use his New Year's address to announce a new campaign to stop the boats, effectively framing refugees and asylum seekers as criminals. And this is, of course, devastating for all people who are seeking asylum in the country. But I think, as will be shown during this talk, that as with many facets of the asylum system, they can have particular repercussions for LGBT plus asylum seekers. So the Rwanda deal is a case in point here. Okay, so aside from any discussion about whether Rwanda is or is not a safe country to send asylum seekers to, I think everyone agrees that it is not a safe place to send LGBT asylum seekers or people to. So to come back to the issue in hand, I'll be highlighting some of the key challenges that LGBT plus asylum seekers face in their asylum claim, particularly relating to issues surrounding their credibility or believability in establishing their asylum case and obtaining evidence to support their claim. So looking at the background of asylum claims in the UK, it's been really well documented that within the UK's Home Office, where asylum claims are considered, there exists a culture of disbelief. And this is a predisposition of Home Office decision makers and caseworkers to disbelieve asylum seekers, right? To actively seek out inconsistencies in their narratives as ways of refusing an asylum claim, and effectively putting all the onus on the asylum seeker themselves to make out the case for their protection claim. And for LGBT plus asylum seekers, this means that applicants are expected to meet what's been described as an impossible burden of proof of their sexuality or their gender identity. And this affects particularly their assessment of credibility, which is a really important aspect of any asylum claim, but particularly for asylum claims based on sexual orientation or gender identity, because we can't so readily point to evidence for those types of claims. And so what the decision maker rests much of their weight on in an asylum determination is the ability of the asylum seeker to articulate their claim. But this can be particularly difficult, especially when people have a history of discretion, of hiding, of not being open about their sexual orientation or their gender identity. Okay? So many asylum seekers that I've spoken to as part of my research have shared feelings of shame or sometimes guilt related to their sexual orientation or gender identity. And for many, this resulted in quite a disjointed sense of self or sense of belonging or self-identification. Some found it difficult to self-identify as being gay, for example, or to ascribe to or to meet these kind of labels that we have in the West, such as, you know, gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. And a lot of this stemmed also from the negative connotations that might be attached to those labels in their home country. And this often stemmed from perceptions of those groups of people in their home country. And it can be much more pronounced if people are indeed fleeing on the basis of their sexual orientation or gender identity and have experienced or been at threat of harm or abuse on that basis. This might have included violence from local communities or in many cases from family members, enforced marriage or rape as a cure for homosexuality, or indeed repression, abuse, imprisonment by the state itself. So you can see that in these kind of situations, when people have effectively trained themselves to hide or be discreet about their sexual orientation or gender identity, then having to articulate that, particularly having to articulate that to a state official in a very official kind of setting, can, I think at the very least, be described as really challenging. And that is especially so for people where non-disclosure is a learned survival strategy that they've adopted. Now, obviously, this isn't true for all asylum seekers, so everyone is going to have their own sense of self, their own sense of identification, but these are some of the common challenges that emerge. And what exactly are these asylum seekers being asked to articulate? Yeah? Well, one of the key criticisms that's been levelled against the UK's asylum system, and indeed asylum systems of many countries in the West, is that asylum applicants are effectively being asked to conform to Western notions of what it means to be gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender, etc. And these are labels that many of us use in the West, and they might have different stereotypes attached to them, but they might not have any meaning or relevance to people from different cultures or from other parts of the world. One quite stark example of this was a famous UK Supreme Court decision from 2010, the case of Iran and HT Cameroon. And this case was in many ways a real triumph for the rights of LGBT asylum seekers. For some years previously, asylum courts had held that LGBT plus asylum seekers should be expected to effectively live in their countries of origin, but being discreet and secretive about their sexual orientation or gender identity to avoid persecution. And many people were denied refugee status on this basis. They were effectively told they could go back to their country of origin and keep a low profile. Right? So the UK Supreme Court in this case rejected this idea, and they held that that people with sexual orientation, gender identity claims shouldn't be asked to stay discreet or secretive in their home country to protect themselves from persecution. They should be eligible for refugee status in the UK. Great win, right? But in making this decision, right, one of the Lord Justices made the now infamous quote. He said, "Just as male heterosexuals are free to enjoy themselves playing rugby, drinking beer, and talking about girls with their mates, so male homosexuals, wait for it, you ready for this? They should be free to enjoy themselves going to Kylie concerts, drinking exotically coloured cocktails, and talking about boys with their straight female mates." Okay? So this is perhaps like quite an extreme example of the really awful stereotyping that can take place. But I think it shows the disconnect that we can have between these dominant kind of Western stereotypes of what it is to be LGBT and the limited relevance that might have for someone coming from Bangladesh or Iran or Uganda, parts of the world that don't have a gay scene, or just for people who don't kind of accord with this out and proud kind of camp stereotype, which can adhere to some of these labels. I mean, it's a bit like assuming that I enjoy sewing just because I'm a woman. Yeah? And I'm sure that for many people seeking protection, the ability to have a brightly coloured cocktail is really the last thing on their minds. Okay, and so we have Home Office guidance for caseworkers, which says that these types of stereotypes should not form part of asylum decision making. But too often we're still having reports of problems with asylum interviews despite this guidance that we have in place. So stereotypes still continue to play a role as evidence in claims. And this is because, as I mentioned, asylum seekers are quite often not able to provide external evidence to corroborate their claims. And this means that decision makers might look to other forms of evidence. So photos of someone attending a pride event or being in an LGBT space. And it also means that there's unnecessary and often quite inappropriate focus on sex as part of asylum interviews. This can include asking unnecessarily intimate questions, unfairly criticising any absence of witness testimony from previous sexual partners. I mean, there's the emphasis on having sexual partners within Home Office asylum's decision making is really quite pronounced. I think that quite often decision makers find it hard to disconnect sexual orientation from sexual activity. And as a result of this approach that's been adopted, then research has shown that some asylum seekers, either unconsciously or sometimes deliberately following advice, might present a version of their narrative or of themselves that accords more readily with what Home Office decision makers might be expecting to see, right? Which accords more readily with these stereotypes. So presenting themselves as being more out and proud, and identifying to these kind of fixed typologies that we have, like lesbian, gay, transsexual, even if that's something that they might not truly believe in themselves, as a way of making themselves more readily understood by the people making decisions about their asylum claims. So I would like to share a quote from one person I spoke to as part of my research, which I think really adds a human perspective to the demands that are placed on many asylum seekers. And she said, "Before, I didn't feel the need to go outside and shout, 'Yes, I'm a lesbian.' Now it's like everything I do, I have to prove something. If I don't put pictures of myself or my new haircut on my Facebook, they'll be saying I'm not open enough. It's not about who you are, really. It's never been about who you are. It's how much of a lesbian are you? Do you go to gay clubs? Do you hang around with other lesbians? How many lesbians can write a letter for you to say, 'Yes, I know her, she's a lesbian'? And of those lesbians, how many lesbians have been accepted by the Home Office or are British?" Now, unfortunately, it doesn't look like this situation is going to improve anytime soon. Some of you might be aware of the new Nationality and Borders Act, which came into force last year. Now, this is a really horrendous act which has lots of really nasty things in it, like creating a two-tiered asylum system depending on how you arrived in the country, making provision to transfer asylum seekers to third countries, so read Rwanda there. But it also includes provisions which change the standard of proof and the rules around evidence in asylum claims, which look like they're going to particularly impact LGBT plus asylum claimants. So these include a higher standard of proof to be met to show that you have a protected characteristic, so effectively to show that you are LGBT. So we're likely to see more probing and intimate questions during interviews, more detailed discussions around traumatic experiences, and interviewers feeling a kind of heightened need to test and push against narratives. We'll probably also see decision makers wanting to see more sensitive documentary evidence and witness statements disclosing intimate sexual relationships. The Act also includes stricter rules on evidence submission to support asylum claims, and given what we know about the evidential and disclosure difficulties in these types of claims in any case, it's likely that these changes in the rules are particularly going to impact asylum claims based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Okay, so I've spoken for far too long already, so I'm going to hand over to my colleague, but very happy to discuss further and answer any questions that you have during the question and answer part of the session. Thanks very much.
Okay, my voice is also going, it seems, but you managed to hold out. So I'm going to sort of build on what Sarah has talked about, focusing a little less on, I guess, the experiences of asylum seekers and refugees, and more on the kind of experiences of providing and receiving support. So that was the focus of my PhD, and I think that's quite helpful as well, given the audience and the theme of this seminar series as well, to think about maybe the kind of more practical issues around what it means to provide care and support to LGBT asylum claimants, what it means to be supported, what are the challenges there. And I've sort of quite loosely kind of gathered my thoughts around 4 themes, but now 5 themes after what I just said, so it's a little bit ad hoc. These themes relate to practical and logistical issues around providing support. The second theme around being a good caregiver, sort of challenges around feeling like you're doing a good job. The third theme is around actually working within the asylum system, the sort of complications and challenges and contradictions even of like engaging with the system. The fourth theme is also being credible, but looking at the sort of credibility of support groups in the eyes of the state as well. It's not just the case, as I'll go on to explain, that anyone can write a support letter and that's taken as proof. There's also an element of proving yourself to be credible as a provider of support that plays a role here. And so I'll think about some of the challenges there. And then finally, I'm going to leave it on a more positive theme around actually the kind of really valuable sort of role that support plays in helping people. So, okay, what is LGBT asylum support? I mean, it's such a broad thing. It covers all sorts of areas from medical, sexual health support through to legal support, through to housing, destitution, and then also sort of broadly more sort of social aspects of support, including going on pride parades and sort of building a kind of support network for people that they can engage in and participate in the cities that they might be living in. But within that, there are all of these theme one, practical logistical issues around actually the viability or the long-term sustainability of that support. It's often the case that the support that's provided specifically to LGBTQ plus people is quite limited. Broadly, the support that is available from NGOs in the third sector might be more general, and so there's often a limited capacity to the amount of support that is available to address specifically LGBTQ plus people, or people with sexual orientation and gender identity-based claims. So that creates a problem in terms of the capacity that people have to address the needs that exist. But also the sustainability of that is quite limiting when you might have one person whose entire job it is to look after 60, 70 LGBT asylum claimants that might live in one city in the UK. And so the kind of long-term effect of that is its sustainability. Like, what if that person becomes unwell? Like, what happens to the support mechanism that exists there? There's a sort of dependency on certain individuals within larger organisations to address these needs. And I think that is a real cause for concern, like their expertise, their knowledge, that might not be sort of archived in a way that could support more systematic care and attention to LGBT asylum claimants. So I think that's one thing we can think about. The other one is around competencies. I think a lot of the work is volunteer-led, so you've got people who might come into the support space out of the goodness of their hearts, and they want to help, and they might be motivated for all sorts of reasons, but they are dealing with extremely complex needs and people going through an extremely complicated bureaucracy and asylum process. And so ensuring people are properly trained to be able to support people, and that people who are being supported feel that they actually have the support that they need. That's another key issue to think about. And that sort of brings me on to the next point around what it means to sort of be a good caregiver and a sort of provider of support. And I think this is where it gets quite interesting and quite tricky, because people's motivations to sort of step into this space and to provide assistance will potentially stem from a kind of criticism maybe of the way that the asylum system works. They want to sort of fill a gap because there's a group of people who are being treated badly by a hostile system. But the kind of reality of working in that space is to encounter and to work in quite close proximity to that system. And so there's a feeling of disempowerment that might come in from that. It's a case of sort of putting a plaster over a gaping wound, effectively. And so there's this sort of real sense of disempowerment that many of the people I spoke to, and in my own experience of providing this support, feel. And I think, I think that's something to consider as well around like trauma, burnout, people who might have PTSD and all of these additional needs. Is it enough that people might be motivated to sort of work in support spaces because they are LGBT themselves, but then actually the experience of caring for someone and providing support to someone who has experienced displacement might be very, very triggering for people and very challenging. So that's another issue that I think support faces. And then thirdly, in terms of working with the asylum system, I think one of the things that, and it sort of touches on credibility as well, is, you effectively feel like you become a sort of bureaucrat adjacent to the state in the way that, it's not possible in some support situations to challenge the system. You may feel that actually you just become, you have to sort of enforce effectively some of the kind of processes that mean that the person you're supporting has become effectively homeless or destitute. You have very limited capacity to actually address some of these more kind of fundamental issues of the system not working. And I think that becomes another challenge around how much are those people working in support roles, how much do they feel they can actually address what they identify as the systematic issues. And I think the third thing we'll talk about today is around advocacy and the scope for actually kind of challenging some of this stuff. Like there's this great theorist in political geography who works on detention, for example, called Nick Gill, and he talks about care over justice. And I think that is something that comes through here, is that it's possible to support someone's acute need, but to provide the help that they need as a whole person, whether that's security, rights, dignity, that becomes quite difficult when you're working in such close proximity to, as Sarah, you described, quite hostile bureaucracies and systems. So that's another thing to think about. And then fourth, this is the one I'll spend a bit more time talking about, is this idea of being credible. And I think a lot of academic research and work on LGBT asylum is rightly focused on the sort of impossible burden of proof that LGBT asylum claimants themselves have to demonstrate that they are LGBT for the purposes of satisfying the Refugee Convention. It's this sort of very kind of legalistic, prove to me that you're LGBT type thing. But that's also something that support groups have to think about as well, because when they're thinking about how they can best support someone, they're aware of the requirement to produce evidence, for example, that the person they're supporting is LGBT. So you might consider how you could structure your social activities around building that evidence case in order to sort of demonstrate to the Home Office that you're LGBT. And so you kind of end up in this quite interesting situation where people are like sort of planning activities around like going to Pride and taking photos and documenting what is supposed to be a quite social sort of activity of like caring for one another, but there's also a real strategic purpose of like documenting these things for the purpose of satisfying decision makers. So there's a kind of intrinsicness to the relationships that form, you could say, which makes people feel uncomfortable and uneasy for lots of reasons. But it becomes quite important given the sort of requirement to prove to the state that the person you're supporting is LGBT. But more broadly than that, I think the state's suspicion of LGBT asylum claimants also extends to the people who support them. It was often commented that people felt that they were treated with hostility, support providers were treated with hostility by Home Office officials, for example, or German BAMF officials, my research was also in Germany, that they were just these sort of lefty liberal types who, didn't care who they were supporting, they just wanted to feel good, things like this. And so there's, this additional requirement on the support provider to also think about how they can prove to the state as well that actually I'm not just writing a letter for anyone, I'm not supporting anyone, I'm being as discerning as you, and you should really value and trust and believe in what it is I'm saying. Which creates an additional challenge. And one example, from the research I did was this church group, actually, a queer church group, who received so much hostility from the Home Office because they didn't, believe that it was possible for this church group to be LGBT, and how confusing. Like the person I spoke to described this like real sense of feeling unwelcome when they were in the courtroom, as though it's just how convenient you found these people, but we don't believe that you're LGBT. Establishing these policies and processes to say, well, actually, look, we're only going to come and support someone in court once they've been here for a certain amount of time, and we're going to make sure that they've met this criteria and this criteria and this criteria. So effectively, the support that might have been motivated by this desire to sort of help unconditionally becomes suddenly quite conditional in terms of demonstrating to the state the sort of that you've been discerning. And then I've got so many other examples of this. I think one of the most interesting ones was in Germany, when a asylum decision maker that I spoke to sort of suspected the motivations that people have for helping, that it's just about getting cash, effectively. If you're running an accommodation centre for LGBT people, you're not interested actually in helping them. You're just interested in making sure you receive that funding, that central funding from the state. So why would I believe anything you have to say to me? Like, you know, and so, and that's where we get onto this really tricky part, that actually the state believes, you could argue, they believe they're doing the right thing. I think that's the other tricky part here, is that some decision makers are convinced that by being discerning, they're catching out the people who are lying, and they're actually making sure that the people who are deserving are safe. And so that's where this additional scrutiny of support providers kind of stems from, is that you're the ones being taken for a fool. We're actually looking out for the rights and interests of people. And I think we can, that's sort of something to think about when we go on to the advocacy, like how do you interface with decision makers and bureaucracies and the logics of bureaucracies if you're advocating for the rights of people? Like, what are your options? How do you influence there? Something to think about. And then finally, a more positive theme, because I feel like I've talked a lot about the kind of negative things that came out, but I think what is just so telling is how the support that is provided, you know, just how important it is to the people who receive it. And there are problems with it, of course, and there's also as well, you know, we're assuming straight away that the people, that every LGBT person or everyone who's making a claim under sexual orientation or gender identity grounds is being supported by an LGBT group. Many aren't, because they are reluctant to come forward. But for those that are, you know, comfortable to approach LGBT groups as well, or like, you know, happen to sort of be referred onwards or whatever, it's like hugely significant for people. People describe it as their family, you know, and it might be the first time actually in their life that they've encountered some kindness or some hospitality since leaving their country of origin. And just one example to finish on, I think, you know, there's all of these assumptions and ideas about who LGBTQ plus people are, where it is they feel safe, what it is that they want. And the example that always stood out to me from my research was this experience of this Muslim lesbian who had left Syria, and she describes the first time that she ever felt safe and welcome was in a church in Peckham. So, you know, because it was where it was the first time she was hugged. It was the first time she felt embraced as a human. And I think, like, you know, beyond these sort of like quite narrow categories and ideas that we have, like about responding to people's needs on a very conditional basis, you have these examples of the kind of unconditionalness of care and support that is provided to people. And I think that then touches on some of the recommendations I'd have around the training that's needed to sort of stop assuming that for LGBT people, the only care and love and support they need is from people who are going to help them in specific ways, and the only ways they could be recognised is if they demonstrate very narrow ideas of who it is they should be.
Thank you so much, both of you. These are such fantastic contributions. I think we could just go on listening to you both without interruption, but let us turn to a couple questions. I mean, a lot of what you mentioned actually reminded me once of a story I read on Austrian officials who, in a very short period of time, rejected someone for being not gay enough and someone for being too gay, who they thought was maybe pretending to be gay because it was too much, and how those both could be used as arguments. And Sarah, you so eloquently, you know, talked about how the asylum system works, and also is a great piece on that you have a chapter that I like a lot on how much of a lesbian are you? That's the title of the piece. And that complements so well with Aydan's work on, the asylum system in many different countries and also how people are trying to change it. And I think that leads a bit to my question, if many of these systems have changed to some degree, or many of the serious concerns about how the state handles these issues have been also, brought to light in that advocacy groups are talking about them. And migrants and asylum seekers are talking about their experiences. And I'm wondering, do you have a sense of kind of an update in a comparative way? Are there any best practice models where an asylum system has potentially changed in a way that's positive? When we look at, of the many states you work at, for example, are there kind of model countries that have a better asylum system than others? It might be a difficult question to answer. Maybe it is just still has a very long way to go everywhere, but I'd be curious kind of in global comparison what you have to say. And then I also was curious, just as a short follow-up, if you could mention some of those groups by name that you have worked with that provide this kind of support, both for people who watch this video who might need that support, but also for people who might want to help these organizations, if there's any that are doing particularly good work in London or in our communities that we might want to know about. So, thank you.
Should I start?
Yeah.
So best practices. I think best practices are quite challenging actually at the moment, just because although there's definitely been progress in the recognition of the rights of LGBT plus people and LGBT plus asylum seekers, just the general hostility to asylum as a whole, which has permeated not just the UK, but I would say countries across the Western sphere at the moment, really put pressure on the asylum system. So we've had some really positive developments, the UK Supreme Court case, which I mentioned, the new guidance for Home Office decision makers, which has come into play. That's all been fantastic, but it's set against the background where there's suggestions that there are quotas that are being set for Home Office decision makers that are expecting them to refuse X number of cases that come before them. And when you are a decision maker that is working under that kind of pressure, then I think it speaks to some of the points that Aydan made about some decision makers might feel like they're actually they're catching people out, in essence, that they're potentially doing the right thing. It might not be for the benevolent, so that all the deserving people can get through kind of reasons, but it's the kind of this culture of disbelief that permeates the system. And because sexual orientation and gender identity claims are those claims that aren't as provable as other ones, which might be related to your ethnicity or the fact that you're fleeing, a really serious conflict, or that your family is being targeted for political reasons. It's generally they're going to come down at the kind of the rough end of the pile. Like, that's a really bad metaphor, but I think you get my point. Yeah. I'll hand over to Aydan.
Yeah, I think in terms of best practices, I agree. It's very difficult. It's very easy to find lots of flaws in efforts, even benign efforts to sort of make things better. Germany is an interesting one in the sense of the close actually working relationship that lots of LGBT asylum support groups have with different state functionaries and sort of the federal states as well as the federal government itself. And that has, I think, been quite effective at, I think they would describe it as like sensitizing or mainstreaming an awareness of LGBT-specific, queer-specific needs within the asylum process and asylum decision-making. The manifestation of that is interesting because it's involved, for example, like, some better sort of more longer-term funding for LGBT-specific asylum support. But it's also, in North Rhine-Westphalia, there is what people call it the LGBT camps. They're sort of effectively accommodation centres for LGBT people who are going through asylum processing, but also broad categories of vulnerable people, women, women with sole women families, people with PTSD, things like this. And, in some ways that's a best practice because it responds to the fact that LGBTQ plus people in accommodation centres face diverse forms of homophobia and transphobia and gender-based violence. So the idea then is you take people away from that and you put them in an LGBTQ specific sort of accommodation area. And of course, this is a case of like, it's quite difficult to know the way through this, but people's experiences of living in those places are not particularly fantastic. You know, they're presented with other problems, including effectively being forced out by their accommodation arrangement. A few people I spoke to were living in what they'd describe as general accommodation, and people were like, why are you going to that camp? That's for the weird people. Is there something you're not telling me? And he had to sort of spin this lie. It was because he was involved in HIV activism, blah, 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 blah. But actually, you know, eventually it came out, and suddenly a support network that he depended on was not available to him in the same way. It's more complicated than that, because he also found some sort of safety and protection there. But it stems back to this issue of how do you fix a system that is fundamentally hostile. And yeah, I think it's kind of gentler asylum system. That's the risk, isn't it, of like some of these sort of best practice reforms. You make what is ultimately quite a violent process of someone deciding whether or not you can stay, what your rights will be, kinder. But it's still sort of laced with some of these difficulties. I don't know if that's too helpful, but that is, yeah.
Yeah, I think accommodation, like as you mentioned, is a really important aspect of the whole asylum process. A lot of my research has focused on detention and the challenges that LGBT asylum seekers face in the detention estate, and it's pretty horrendous, as you can imagine. I mean, immigration detention by itself is horrendous. You might have heard some of the really terrible stories that have been coming out over the past decade about the very high rates of self-harm and suicide, the bullying and harassment by staff at detention centres, which are usually privately contracted firms such as Serco, etc. Really poor health provision. I mean, there was the awful scandal at Marston Reception Centre with the irregular boat arrivals recently as well, which resulted in deaths. So immigration detention is an awful thing in itself. But if you're an LGBT asylum seeker, the irony is that you're probably going to be held in an immigration detention system with communities of people that you've actually sort of potentially been fleeing from, right? Or that are disapproving of your sexual orientation and gender identity. And so you are forced, in many cases, to be discreet, secretive, hide who you are. And at the same time, you're concomitantly having to prove to the Home Office that you are out and proud and you're super camp and that you're part of all of these LGBT support groups, right? So you get you end up in this very strange situation. And there have been positive developments. There's meant to be LGBT, support staff in each of these centres. It's usually not the case. So there have been those positive developments. But the problem is that the intention is to increase the immigration detention estate in the UK at the moment, right? That is the explicit intention of the government. So if you have increased detention for everyone, that's going to mean more detention for LGBT asylum seekers as a subset of the everyone. And it's not going to be very nice.
Yeah, and following on from that as well, I think attempts to sort of say indefinite detention should not exist, but also if it is existing, LGBT people should be removed from that system. I think the No Safe Haven report, I can't remember, by Stonewall and UK LGIG, now Rainbow Migration.
Was my report.
Yes, of course, yeah. And then, but the follow-on did you see the sort of response was that, you must, I mean, obviously, but the, was like, was something about, we'll make sure all the residents are aware of our zero tolerance policy.
Yeah, it doesn't help when you're, a transgender person who's not recognised as being transgender because you're self-medicating or you haven't hit, the Home Office is quite strict definitional conditions of what it means to be transgender, and so you're held in the wrong sex institution and you haven't been able to use the shower for 2 weeks because you're too terrified of going into the communal shower space.
Yeah. But there's a zero tolerance
But there's a zero tolerance
that
policy.
everyone's read.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, it's all so interesting. I want to ask one more question, and then I want to move to the audience. And the question is more geared towards researchers or students we have who might be interested in learning from the experience you have working on these topics. And This is, I think fieldwork in this area is particularly challenging in certain ways because we're dealing with very vulnerable communities. And I know you've both written on this aspect in certain ways as well, on doing research in this area. And I was wondering if you could give us just a few, reflections on your work doing research with migrants and asylum seekers, not just LGBTQ, in general, if you have any thoughts or words of wisdom in that regard.
Yeah. Well, I think as a scholar that focuses on the refugee and forced migration field, one of the key things I would say is don't just run out and want to do research with asylum seekers and refugees. Be respectful of the fact that these are people with their own autonomy and their own lives to live. And so just always be mindful of that fact when you might, for very benevolent reasons, want to run around conducting research and speaking to people about these incredibly traumatic experiences. It's not something to be undertaken lightly. So the research that I undertook, for example, with detained asylum seekers was in collaboration with an LGBT support group that they were working with, the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group, and with Stonewall, and we had a big support structure built in around that for those people that were taking part in the research. And it's also really important to be mindful of your own well-being as a researcher as well. I think the researcher that had gone before me on a previous project had to end up going into counselling, right? These are really difficult areas to be working in, so always being mindful of your own well-being is very important.
Yeah, and I think really quite hard about how you'll approach this. It's not something that you can just do on a whim. You've got to build those relationships. I think you're dealing with people who may have experienced a lot of trauma and things like that. And so there's this whole kind of Edward Alessi, who is a visiting researcher here at UCL at the moment, works on LGBT asylum in South Africa and has developed this really interesting trauma-informed research methods guidance, which I recommend anyone interested should read. And I think what the things that really emulates, it's sort of good ethical practice in general, is being accountable, being honest, being sort of consistent. I think that's also really important. Like if you're engaging with a support group, be consistent, do what it is you'll say you'll do, be reliable, be upfront about issues or mistakes you've made. And I think all of this is really helpful because you're building trust with people. You don't want to extract things, and you want to sort of make sure you've got the the time to develop those trusting relationships. And the other thing I found quite helpful was to sort of make the research politically relevant to the work that is actually being done by support groups, to make it in some way relevant to the experiences of those who are going through the asylum system. So think hard about your research questions and what it is that they might reveal, and how that might be useful in some way, because I think there is an onus on research in this area to be helpful in some way. Like that's obviously quite a broad term, but I think for me that's quite important. So you want to have those conversations with support providers as well early on. Like what are the questions you would like me to ask? Like what are the things would help you in your work? And obviously you want to maintain a bit of independence, but that should come once you've built those relationships. And so spend the time and do it right, I guess.
Yeah. I think being really explicit about any benefit that will or will not accrue to the person as a result of taking part in the research. And if there isn't any benefit to that individual or to, trying to make changes in the refugee or asylum system itself, then you might question the ethics of asking that person to take time out from their life and to share, those very personal details with you.
Yeah. I skipped your question about support groups as well. Stonewall and Rainbow Migration, on their website, they've got a great list of like the support that exists in the UK. It's just so much of it actually. And I won't name the specific support groups that I worked with in my research because that's kind of a little bit confidential. But the look on that list and you'll see a great group. And then also Queer European Asylum Network, and then Queer Refugees Deutschland, I think, have a sort of list again of like support groups operating across Europe. So definitely have a look at that if you're interested.
That's so helpful. Thank you very much, and thanks also for your remarks, both of you, about your research practice, which is very important to think about how to ethically navigate this really important research, which we do need, but also how to protect and keep people safe in the process. I'd like to now turn it over to the floor, so whoever has a question, I will, we're sharing the mic, so I can bring it to you. Oh, Paolo's just helping me. Okay. All right. Does anyone have a question? Please raise your hand if you do. All right. We have Shiyu and then Alan.
I'm curious about the operation of the NGO. Like when it comes to get fund, where can we, because we don't know what kind of company they support LGBT and what kind of company they don't. So,
Sorry, could you bring the mic a little bit closer, I think?
Oh, yeah, I'm curious about the operation of NGO because we need money, we need fund. And when it comes to get fund, where can we seek help? Because we don't know what company they support our group and which company they don't.
Do you mean like the politics of the NGOs, what they support, or the?
Yeah, like for an NGO, where do their money come from?
Oh, I see. Yes. That's. They should be transparent about that. Most of them are like established as charities. So on their website, that information will be there. But a lot of them are referred to through larger organisations as well. So if you are an LGBT asylum claimant and you are, for example, speaking with a caseworker at the Red Cross or the Refugee Council, and a particular need relating to your claim comes up, that there'll be a list of trusted organisations, and so that's sort of how it works. You've got these referral mechanisms that emerge, and so most people are referred onwards, the people I spoke to anyway, for a lot of the support. But then there's also an interesting thing, people because some of the people who work in this sector are quite visible. They might get inquiries from people living in the country of origin, so they might get messages on Twitter or messages on their email, and that's another tricky thing because they can't be seen to say to them, come here and I can help you, because that is a sort of persecutable incitement to migrate, and so that's also tricky. Again, we can help you when you're here, but it's very tricky. So it's referral mechanisms, I think, would be the main way. But they should be transparent about who funds them. It's often charitable donations, and then maybe some grant funding. But yeah, it's all quite limited.
Okay.
I hope that answers.
Okay, thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much. This has been really, really fascinating. So thank you. Question mainly for Sarah, I guess. So I thought you set out the problem with enormous clarity and power. I'm just wondering what you see the solution as being, that a government that we might plausibly have in the future, presumably not the current one, but a government that we can conceive of happening might adopt. Because presumably any government is going to be concerned about if you reduce the evidential requirements, then you're creating a system that's open to abuse. So, are you arguing that actually abuse isn't going to happen, or abuse in scare quotes isn't actually a problem, or we can actually devise a system that would be able to address the problems that you've raised, while also being able to deal with a challenge from abuse of the system?
Sure. I think it's a really good question. I think the caseworker guidance that the Home Office has in place is actually really good, and it strikes a really good balance, right? The problem is that it's not being followed by decision makers, because there's a lot of problem on decision makers when they're deciding, when they're determining asylum cases. So I think that on the paper there's quite a good balance that's been struck there. It's just that in practice there's so much pressure, not only on, for LGBT plus asylum cases specifically, but if you look at the whole cohort of asylum cases that are decided, such a huge proportion of them end up going to the upper tribunal and succeeding in their appeals. It's over 50% get overturned on appeal. That's a huge high number, and it shows the really poor quality of first instance decision making that's being made at the Home Office across the board, right? So I think that in order to make the system better, first of all, removing this pressure that's on decision makers, right, to refuse such a high number of cases, because it doesn't serve anyone any good, especially when the cases end up getting overturned on appeal. All that's done is it's wasted a whole lot of taxpayers' money and tribunal time in seeing that claim through. The second key thing is open up legal routes for asylum seekers, to stop all these irregular entries, but then also irregular overstayers. A lot of, I mean, you know, it does vary case to case, but we find a lot of LGBT plus asylum cases, they're people that came into the country regularly. They might be from a country which doesn't have a visa restriction on it. They might have had a short-term visa for a certain period of time, and then they've overstayed. They end up getting detained. It's just a big mess. It costs the taxpayer a huge amount of money. If you open up regular routes of asylum, then I think it would serve to, you know, avoid a lot of these very cumbersome, very costly and time-consuming processes that are quite traumatising for the people involved, and they don't do the country as a whole any good either. Yeah. Also, if you just let everyone work, then it would solve this labour shortage issue that we have at the moment. So, you know, migration is not always a bad thing.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. That was really extremely interesting. I come from migration research, and you know, like one of these general findings is that, you know, those first interaction with bureaucracy, of refugees with bureaucracy, will inform basically your integration prospects, right? Because this gives you a signal of how the state and society maybe, you know, is likely to treat you in the future. And this seems particularly, you know, relevant for what you've been saying today, especially because the signal that you get is not only about kind of, you know, like my own ethnicity, but it's much broader than that, right? It seems like you receive a signal of what it means to be a good lesbian in a society, or, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And so I'm just wondering whether you have any thought from your experience of how this process actually affects integration afterwards. So for those people who actually manage to navigate the system and get asylum eventually, does this have an impact on how, you know, they integrate in society afterwards? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so yes, it does. Yeah, I mean, a few like examples from the research. I think over the time that I was doing it, some people did get granted their refugee status, and I think it's one of these things where it becomes filled with all this hope, that like so much hope is put on the bureaucracy that that's going to solve all the problems, I guess, and then actually suddenly it's not maybe address the problems, and there's a sort of people often will describe suddenly feeling actually that's the moment they do all their processing and a lot of the sort of difficulty of the last period of time, however long it's been, really gets dealt with. And so it can be this odd experience of like both finally feeling that you've got that ticket to liberation, you know, in that very homonormative sort of, finally I've convinced the British state that I am gay, and now I'm free. But suddenly actually it's quite a kind of an emotionally ambiguous time, and people describe and there's lots of research on this as well, like think of the sort of affective dimensions of queer asylum and migration, of like of actually feeling the refugee status, that's their label now, and suddenly they continue to be followed around by this sort of legal system that like I will try and go dating, but I'm afraid people will pity me because I'm a refugee, and so it remains this sort of like kind of, I don't know, bureaucratic thing that sort of haunts them. And so, yeah, it does, I think, in a lot of cases. But then there are also cases where that's not the case, and people have more positive experiences, I guess. But does that answer your question, I think? Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate that you both probably work more on the receiving sort of side of this. But I wondered if you could say a little bit more about sort of perhaps trends or patterns in kind of sending in sort of the sending side of the equation, as it were. I don't know anything about this area, but I wonder whether some of the sort of trends in kind of democratic backsliding more generally and kind of diminutions in sort of protection of minority rights, even in a lot of sort of relatively democratic countries, is that leading to greater numbers of LGBTQ plus people, seeking asylum elsewhere, or so is this going to be a sort of are we seeing more people seeking asylum? Just.
Yeah, I'm not sure that's a very easy question to answer, actually. It's quite a difficult one. I mean, we're seeing improvements in LGBT rights in a number of countries across the world, but we're also seeing a backsliding, as you mentioned, in a number of locations. I was having a look at UK asylum statistics the other day, LGBT claimants, and I think we're pretty much at pre-COVID levels now. I don't think we've seen a significant increase or decline, except for we had a bit of a hiatus during that COVID period where we had significantly less asylum claims. So that's what I could say about asylum claims being made in the UK, but I'm not sure I could comment more broadly. I'd have to look into that. I think that would be an area for further research. Yeah.
Yes, I don't have like the sort of, I don't know the stats on it or like to say what the trends are. But, I think, for example, I think the sense is that maybe there's more of a kind of growing awareness of it within the policy world of like actually addressing LGBT protection issues, whether that's through the asylum system, but also, in countries of origin, and what are the kind of opportunities there to sort of promote human rights, largely as in relation to preventing onward migration as well to some extent. Like there's also a little bit of that, but again, I don't know beyond that. An example would be though, for example, of like the current situation facing LGBTQ plus Russians in the context of the war in Ukraine. It's very difficult now to actually seek asylum as a Russian national because of the war in a place that might have LGBTQ plus rights. So a lot of people are in Georgia, I think, and there's some support that exists there for queer Russians, but like that is an example of where, the protection gaps have increased actually for a country that is experiencing significant backsliding on all sorts of things. So yes, that's but again, don't have anything beyond anecdotes for that.
I think we have two questions in the back there, Paul. Thank you for helping me.
Hi, I'm Andrea Kaflish. I work as a PhD researcher here at UCL. I had a question about the role of international organizations in this. Of course, you work both in the UK, but I was curious if you had any thoughts on the role that UNHCR and IOM play in building the legal discourse and policy discourse around LGBT migration. And perhaps in particular, sort of going beyond the Refugee Convention, what role can both organizations play in reinforcing the legal rights, sort of a human rights framework around this, and so moving us beyond the situation where you need to be an asylum seeker in order to migrate as an LGBT person?
Yeah, I think UNHCR and IOM and other organisations do play quite an active role in what they describe as like sort of LGBT mainstreaming within the sort of support they provide, and a sort of awareness of this and how it would affect reception and things. I've seen a few kind of guidance notes, for example, that UNHCR have been very good at holding states to account when they've failed, for example, to respect the rights of LGBTQ plus people when they make their claims, and have been quite vocal about some of that. Examples might be, this is less of an example of vocalness, but like the sort of role, for example, the Turkish government played in terms of facilitating LGBT resettlement and things was, maybe better than you'd expect. And I think part of that was because of UNHCR's advocacy around that particular issue. You can get into that. There's not the time to get into that, but that I think would be one example where where they see it as a kind of core part of their mandate, and it's never really been, I don't know, an issue of like convincing UNHCR to be proactive on it, is my sense, but I don't know enough.
Yeah, I would agree. I think maybe not so much for IOM, because I don't think IOM have a human rights mandate. I might be wrong about that because it's not a core focus of my research, but I would agree. I think for UNHCR it's quite a core component of their work and their advocacy and their engagement with states, but for IOM perhaps not so much. I might be wrong.
And in Europe, the International Lesbian, Gay, Bi, Trans and Intersex Association Europe, that regional organization has worked really hard at lobbying the European Union on its asylum policy, and you see to kind of respect asylum on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. And they play somewhat of a watchdog role. I was actually reading a little bit about their current report where they're hassling the European Union on kind of differences in how states are respecting asylum on the basis of gender identity and gender expression and sexual characteristics, for example, as opposed to some improvements on sexual orientation, and asking also the EU to rethink about its usage of safe countries at all when it applies to LGBT people, kind of like as you were both saying. So these kind of pressures at the international level, I think, are quite important as well.
Yeah, and related to that as well is work around like queering atrocity prevention as well. So there's a project I'm working on at the moment, Farida's here from organisation called Protection Approaches, and that's quite interesting because it's another example of where you might, for example, engage LGBT communities in what would we describe as country of origin, for example, in monitoring and reporting on atrocity-related backsliding, things like this. And so it's sort of building a more comprehensive, I guess, framework for addressing the risks and the sort of the things that contribute to rising vulnerability prior to displacement happening, and being sensitive to LGBT-specific SOGI-related violence and vulnerabilities. So there is a clear kind of move towards sort of growing awareness of these things at earlier stages, I guess, but yeah.
We have one other question, and then that will, maybe we can take one more after that. Yeah, right back there.
So there's been a lot of focus on sexuality issues and how the Home Office interacts with cases of people who have certain sexualities, proving that they're gay or lesbian. Considering the government's pretty consistent stances on trans people, how does the Home Office deal with trans asylum claims? Or is that difficult to research or near impossible to research?
One of the challenges that trans people face is that the Home Office has quite a restrictive definition of what it considers to be transgender. So a number of people, particularly people who are self-medicating, self-transitioning, would fall outside of the scope of that definition, and it might be difficult for them to establish an asylum claim on that basis. And it can also affect the way that they are accommodated in immigration detention centres, for example, because they might not be recognised as the gender to which they're transitioning to. They're recognised as their gender of birth. So I think, I mean, Aydan, you can correct me if you have some more recent information on that, but that's my understanding, is that quite narrow definitions pose a real barrier for trans people. Yeah, and I think also gendered assumptions playing a big part about like being feminine or masculine enough. Yeah. So not a real understanding of like what it might mean to be non-binary, or what it might mean to sort of be gender fluid, or to experience your gender as a sort of not fixed sort of thing. And so that I've heard of instances where that has played a role. Yeah. Like, yeah. Yeah, and you know, there's cases, you know, say if you self-identify as female, but being told that you don't look like a female enough. Yeah. I think a lot of it is limited understanding on the base on decision makers. And it's not just Home Office decision makers though; it's tribunal judges as well. They're drawn from a certain sector of society, and they might not be as exposed to different ways that people live. Yeah. Yeah.
We would have time for one more question if anyone is itching to ask something. You know, speak now or forever hold your peace. Oh, yeah, hand up. I can. You don't have to yell. Here.
So, if there is this limit to the strategic use of stereotypes, I mean, sometimes you're not gay enough, or you're too much gay to be a real gay. and thinking about affection and affects, how, like, if pains and not, would be like enough effect, like to mobilize decision makers, to grant, the word you use, deserve the status of refugee. So thinking about all the affections that we could mobilize, or that you see during the research on the court, what could be like a possible way and a strategic way, if stereotypes are not enough, to get the granting and this deserving status? Because sometimes it just feels like deserving, I connect with charity.
Yeah.
And somehow like this white savior thing, like you're doing something good to the person that is like suffering and articulating pain, this narrative.
Yeah. I think, if I understood your question correctly, like affect, like how that plays a role in decision making is huge. Like these courts are very intimidating, scary places. People have an emotional relationship to them. People's responses to them will be very different. So it's quite even difficult to think about how you are going to strategically feel or create a sense of feeling with the decision maker. But there are interesting things, like people would say that they'd say things that the straight judge is never going to understand. Like, well, you come on to the gay club with us, and then it's like, well, why would I ever do that? You know, like, or it's almost like you sort of throw the uncomfortableness back at people. Is an example that one person said they might like use sometimes, which I thought was quite interesting, because it's almost about like the feeling of sort of the judge's feeling of like trying to make a decision about someone and their life. Like you could play into those like, well, it's been really hard, but now I'm really happy, and that's like a kind of very kind of logical, like, yes, I understand how you've gone from oppression to liberation, great. But then there's also the other part of it, like proving that you're gay and like what that means to feel gay and be gay and all of the rest of it. And there's a whole world that's not understood by someone there who's making the decision. And I think you can engage with that a little bit, but I don't know if that is a strategy. I think it's the whim of the decision maker. I think it's kind of like the challenge of a lot of this stuff. Like I'm not convinced, or I am convinced. I don't know. Do you have?
I think I agree. Like the decision-making process, particularly when you get to a tribunal decision where you are sort of having to stand there in front of a judge. I mean, a number of the participants that took part in my research, I think, described quite an amazing journey of where they became these really, I hate to use the word empowered, but I'm going to use it, the word empowered, because effectively the legal advice that they had access to was so limited, they ended up representing themselves. And the pride that they took in going into that court space, which is effectively what it is, representing themselves and trying to give their side of the story to that person, it was quite a meaningful process for them. It didn't always have positive outcomes, right? And there was frustration that they weren't being listened to effectively. But I think just having that opportunity to have your case heard in many ways was quite a big moment for them.
We have a couple minutes left, and before we thank our speakers for this really incredible talk, I wanted to end on one note, since we talked a lot about how how vulnerable communities, migrants and asylum seekers, and what advocacy has done to support such communities. But one point that I also wanted to end on is that these communities have done a whole lot for broader LGBTQ people. And I study a little bit transnational activism and advocacy, and looking at how these organizations that work across countries in the world are advocating for rights that have made certain kinds of rights that we become familiar with nowadays appear in many different countries. And I was very often sitting across from people that have very mobile histories, oftentimes former migrants and refugees. And what was quite special about these activists is that they've navigated sexuality and gender identity in many different places. And for them, navigating that, which is a very intricate and different experience from context to context, is something they've lived through so actively, and they're also the ones that are emotionally connected through solidarity to stories of, the state repression of LGBT people in other places, including their home countries, but other countries as well. So they've done a huge service. I think when we look at transnational mobilization, which has been so important, we see such a mark, I think, by queer migrants in that process. I just thought it was an important element to end on this very important discussion. I also want to ask you or remind you about our next event in the series, which happens next Thursday, February 2nd. It's on the theme of who are the markets, or quote unquote the markets, and what determines their reaction to policy. And this event will be followed by a drinks reception. Please feel free to sign up via our website at the Policy and Practice Lab or on Eventbrite. And if you don't already, please do follow Policy and Practice on Twitter or Instagram. Our handle is UCLSPP. And we'll also announce all of our forthcoming events there, as well as keep you in touch with interesting research that our community is doing. Now, most importantly, I really want to thank you both so much, and I'm sure everyone will join me in that, for a really stimulating conversation. Gave us a lot to think about, and we're just so grateful for the time and insights you've shared to us this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you.